Hey, this is Chris with Phoenix Gaming. We're going to do something a little bit different today. It's actually something I've never really done in the past. We're going to do kind of a compare and contrast video. And today we're going to talk about Warhammer Old World and Kings of War. And before we dig in, the reason I wanted to make this video is because I had been kicking around whether or not I wanted to get into Kings of War. And I am a previous Warhammer Fantasy player. And I do still dabble in Old World, so I was really trying to decide if this was something that I had an interest in before I invested my money and my time into it. And I had reached out to a few communities, and I said, hey, I'm an Old World player. I play Firefight, and I've been considering Kings of War. Can somebody kind of walk me through what the differences are? In the multiple places that I asked that question, I generally got the same types of answers. I got a lot of negative commentary about one game or the other, depending on where I would ask it. Like, maybe it would be, oh, Kings of War is just Diet Warhammer, or, oh, Warhammer Old World is just GW capitalizing on nostalgia, etc. You know, so it didn't really answer my questions. And I didn't intend for it to be such a trigger point or a divisive question. I just wanted to understand if there was any key differences so that I knew what I was potentially getting into. So the only big announcement I want to make is I do have the Plague Support video coming. I've got a couple other videos in the works. I will kind of get those out into the world once they are ready. And I do have some streams that will be coming again soon. I know I did a lot, and then I cooled off, and then I'm going to do a lot. And a lot of it is just making sure I can give variety. I can get players, but I want to make sure I'm getting and showing a variety of either game systems or at least armies. I don't want it to be like every time you watch a stream, it's, oh, Chris's Enforcers against this person's Plague, for example. So we want to make sure we're doing a little bit of variety is all. Now, what I want you all to know is what this video is it's intended to kind of clear up any misconceptions or preconceived notions that you might have about both games. Because, again, as a person who's predominantly played Warhammer Fantasy or Old World, I haven't touched Kings of War, or at least hadn't until since first edition. I forget when it first came out, but it's been at least 10 years since I've put that game on the table. So I wanted to help clear up any kind of misconceptions players might have about either of those games. And then I want players to understand how these games are alike and how they're different and what it is about each game that sets it apart from the other. And what I think really the overall goals of each game are. And what I mean by that is okay, so Warhammer 40K is not a war game. That's not its goal. It is a tabletop strategy game. And there is a weird kind of difference. You know, games like this Quars War, I would put in the war game category. Historicals, a lot of those I would put in the war game category. Bolt action kind of skirts that line, for example. Whereas, you know, AOS, 40K, games that are kind of built the same way, where your armies don't actually have to be armies. They kind of play and flow a bit more like if you were playing Magic the Gathering with models. Those, to me, kind of fall into that tabletop strategy. And, again, none of them are any better than the other. I'm just trying to explain how I'm categorizing things. So, you know, we're going to kind of talk about what I think each game's kind of goal is and how they're different. There's not really a script for this, because this is a video that I sat here and I thought, man, if I don't sit here and I don't do this now, I'm going to forget, and then it's not going to get done. So I'll do my best to edit any kind of tangents that I go on out, but I may just put it all up there so everybody can get my free-flowing thoughts on everything. But I will also do my best to make sure that I timestamp stuff so it's at least easier for you to navigate. And then one of the other things I want to do is I do want to give players just the most basic of walkthroughs of how a game or the rule systems kind of work. Again, mostly so that they can understand if they wanted to get into one game or the other, or both, what it is they are looking at. What this video is not designed to do is this is not designed to be divisive. Like, I'm not doing this to be like, Game X is better than Game Y. I will do my best to kind of keep my bias out of it. There's going to be some things where I'm like, I think this is a bad interaction in this game, and that's going to be for both games. But ultimately, I'm not here to tell you what I think is good and what I think is bad. I'm just trying to give you a basic rundown on how these games operate so that if you were thinking, hey, I kind of want to play this game, how is it different from a game I already play? This might help you. And, like I said, this isn't a judgment of either game, either system, or their parent companies. I'm sure the people who run Mantic are good people. I'm sure the people who run GW are good people. I know some of the GW staff, obviously, because of my history with the company, whereas like my history with Mantic is a bit more limited, but I have talked with their rules committee and stuff like that. And by and large, I've had positive interactions with both companies. So I don't really have a bias in that regard. So I will do my best to, again, try to keep anything negative in that regard out of the video. So we can just focus on what it is we're here to talk about. So the first thing I want to discuss is, what are they? Because they're both in the same kind of category or umbrella of games. They're both what we would call a rank and file game. And if you don't know what that means, it effectively just means that units have to move in a formation. And what I'll do is we'll pull up an example of that so I can kind of show anybody who's never played either what I mean. And the reason we're going to use Universal Battles is just because it's easy, it's free, and I can just jump on it real quick. I probably should have just streamed this. When you play a game like Old World or you play a game like Kings of War, your units are going to be in a formation. And I'm going to try to grab a few because I know they're not the easiest to see. Bam. All right. So when you're playing a rank and file game, you see how your units have to be in these squares or these rectangles. These are formations. And then they actually have to move in formations. So they have to move in straight lines. If they turn, right? If they turn, you're going to need to, let's grab you, wheel. So if you wanted to turn, see, you could wheel. So in Old World, for example, and we'll kind of break this down just a little bit, you might, we want to do this. You might want to move and turn, right? So you might go, all right, I'm going to move, but then I also need to change my facing, so I'm going to wheel. And you just add those two movements together. So if I had 10 inches of movement, I might move 4.5 inches here. And then as I wheel, I have to measure that wheel. And then I can go, okay, I've now moved 10 inches. 6 plus 4, whatever. So that's kind of how a rank and file system works. Your facing is going to matter. Your units are going to have a front and rear arc. So again, if they're facing this way, this is our front arc. We'll have flanks. Sorry about the weird coloring on the video. Sometimes if my lighting's not just perfect, it does this. And then you're also going to have a rear. And getting charged in the front, getting charged in the flank, getting charged in the rear, all that stuff is going to be important. So rank and file games are typically won and lost, not in your damage output per se. Yes, it's important, but it's more in your ability to maneuver and position to maximize that damage output. And sometimes you don't even need to get the damage. You just need to do things that would maybe force a morale check, etc. So what you're looking at with a rank and file game is much less a what super unit power do I have that I can use that's going to wombo combo somebody. And more of a, I need to understand how to manipulate and move and maneuver and then maybe set traps. So if you're a student of, like Napoleonic Wars or even like chivalric wars or even ancient Rome, understanding how Hannibal maneuvered and positioned his units when, during the Punic Wars is going to more directly translate here than it would in a game like 40K. So that's what a rank and file game is. And now that we've established that, both of these are a rank and file game. I'm trying to think of where we need to go to. Let's talk about how they're similar. Okay? So both games are similar in that A, they use formations, B, they're medieval fantasy, C, they use what we call USRs, or universal rules, right? And they're D6 based, so there's a lot of similarities. They're both I go, you go structured games, and let's talk about why that's not as detrimental in a system like this as it is in a system like 40K or AOS real quick. The reason I go, you go, and what I mean by that is I take my whole turn, movement, shooting, charging, fighting, etc. I do all of it on my turn, then you do all of it on your turn. With most medieval fantasy games that are set up like this in rank and file, that turn structure isn't quite as bad for a lot of reasons. One, shooting is typically a lot less accurate. You get -1 to hit if you move and you shoot. You get -1 to hit in some games if you're in long range. So you have a lot of these modifiers. Most of the units aren't ever going to hit better than 4s base. You do have a few, but if you're already hitting on 4s, and then you've got like a -4 to hit or a -2 to hit, you're now hitting on 6s. So you're not incredibly accurate. So again, that's part of the game design. That's intentional because the game's not designed or intended to just be, I'm going to line up my whole army and just shoot you off the table. It's designed to try to recreate some of that feel of older, like a medieval formation style combat. So like your archers can't all shoot in a lot of games, only maybe your first 1 or 2 ranks, for example. So where these two are similar, like I said, you've got I go, you go. And we've just established why that's not as bad, because shooting's not as bad. If shooting were much worse, it could be way worse. So they both have that turn structure. They both, like I said, they center around medieval fantasy. They both have wizards and knights and monsters and all these other things. Universal special rules are going to be just a bucket of rules that you can assign, or keywords that you can assign to different units. A great example is if you're a modern 40K player, you're going to understand what they are, because 10th edition has gone to USRs. That's one of the few really positive things that I like about 10th edition. And a good example of a USR is Feel No Pain, right? If you're an Old Hammer, I don't remember if it's still called Feel No Pain, I think it is. But if you're an Old Hammer player, you understand what a Feel No Pain is. And so a unit might just say like, Feel No Pain 5+. Well, then you go to the core rules and you look for Feel No Pain and it tells you. So what that does is that makes it easier for everybody to be on the same page with rules. And again, if we go to 8th and 9th edition 40K, you're going to see the lack of USRs and how that affected, especially 9th, how that affected it. Because there were armies that had the same rule, but they were worded just a little differently, so then they could be interpreted a little differently. And a lot of that has to do with because like one group of rules writers might have wrote this group of codexes, but then another group might have wrote this group of codexes. And when you have two different groups that are writing rules, that's just more opportunity if there's no standardization for things to not be worded the same and create these situations. So I think USRs are great. I think it's fantastic that both of these games use them. They both rely heavily on maneuvering. They both rely heavily on, understanding positioning, your characters and how they interact, stuff like that. So we'll talk about some real quick differences between the two, and then we'll move on. So real quick, Old World is going to feel a lot chunkier, grittier, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot more rules, and that's not good, that's not bad, it's just a different experience. In Old World, there's a lot of rules for a lot of different things. Even if we just look at movement. Whereas Kings of War tends to kind of look at it and go, okay, let's take this very complicated style game, and let's see if we can pare some of this stuff down and still make it work. And again, I think movement is a great example. So we're going to talk about how these games are different in how you move. So for Old World, we've already got our units here. So let's grab this handsome... Actually, we'll grab this bigger one so it's a little bit easier to see. We're going to put it right here. So in Old World, when you move, you have a lot of options, right? You can not move. You can march, which is a double move. You can move. And then you have what are called maneuvers. And you're only allowed, and I'm going off memory, but I'm pretty sure you're only allowed one maneuver when you move. So like when you move, you can wheel, and that's included in your move, but you can't pivot. And you might be able to pivot, but again, not the point. A lot of it is that like it's very rigid and very this is how you do things. So again, if I wanted to take this unit and I wanted to maybe move them so that they were facing this direction, I have a few different options. I can literally wheel them, and I'd have to march, right? Because if they move maybe 4 inches or 8 or 6 inches or whatever, we'd have to really just like march them to double move them. I could stand still, and then I think that takes a quarter of your movement if you pivot. And just pivot up to 90 degrees. And then you still have a quarter of your movement. So again, if you move, let's call it 4 inches, you take an inch of it to pivot, and now you have 3 inches of movement left. But because you've pivoted, I believe that's a maneuver, and now you can't do any other maneuvers. So like you can't sidestep. You can't reverse step. And that's fine. It's just you have that option. You can do it the other way, things like that. What Kings of War does to kind of say, okay, this is this really complex situation where we have all these different units and we want to move them. How do we make this so that it's a little faster, a little easier? And again, that's not to say it's better or worse. It's just different. So with Kings of War, what they do is at any point during your movement, you're allowed 190-degree pivot. And that's just the generic rule. Again, there's always exceptions. So again, if I wanted to maybe have the unit facing this way, what I could do is if they move 4 inches or 5 inches or whatever, we could move them up, and then we could literally just end on a pivot. There's no wheeling. There's no things like that. It's just move, pivot. And you can do it at any point. So I could literally go like this and then move them. I could go like this and then pivot and then like this. The main thing is that you just have to move forward, right? Because you have a facing. You have to move forward. And if you don't move forward, you don't get to pivot. And you have your movement. And that's pretty much the same in both games. But that's how the games differ in movement. And that is really the big difference in their design philosophies. Old World is designed to be a much, I don't want to say deeper game. It is much more rules heavy. But if I say deeper, I feel like that sends the wrong connotation. Because Kings of War is actually surprisingly deep once you learn it. So it's more like you have this game that's designed to be used to create mass battles. You have all these different rules for all these different situations, and it's designed to take a little bit longer. It's designed to play a little bit slower. And if that's what you want, that's awesome. Because like I do enjoy Old World. So again, I'm not saying anything negative. Kings of War is designed to take those concepts and just kind of speed them up a little bit. And it does it very well. So if you want that kind of rank and file game, but not in the 3 to 4 hour times that Old World can take, like this is a good way to do it. One of the next things that we're going to compare and contrast, I guess, is kind of how they handle damage. We'll do turn structure, we'll do damage output, and we'll do leadership, because they're all kind of tied together. So in both games, you have phases, right? You have your movement phase, You have your shooting phase, and you have your fight phase. Now, Old World does have, I think, 2 extra phases in addition to that. And honestly, Kings of War might have 1 more, because there might be like an end phase in both of them. But Old World also has what's called the command phase. And this is just kind of like the before your turn starts area. You know, again, if you're a 40k player, that's when you gain command points. In Old World, that's when you're going to like check for morale on anybody who's routed. That's when you're going to do compulsory moves, stuff like that. So it's one of those where it's just an extra phase for interactions that would really just kind of happen out of the normal turn sequence. That's all it is. So both games are going to have a very similar setup. Old World is going to take the magic and spread it out among all those phases. So again, if you're an old fantasy player and you're thinking about Old World, that's an important distinction as well. Because in Old Fantasy, there was a magic phase. Now it's just spread out throughout the turn. If it's a spell that would affect your movement, it's done in the movement phase. If it's a ranged attack, it's done in the shooting phase, etc. If you just kind of think about it, you can kind of logically determine where those spells would go. You have a whole separate magic test. You roll 2 dice, you add your wizard level, blah, 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 blah. Kings of War takes the magic and effectively just slams it all into the shooting phase. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, because I haven't, I've played a handful of games, but it's been with my kids, so we've kind of slowly been bringing more and more into it. But really, what I've seen so far is that magic everything is basically a ranged attack. So if I want to heal one of my units, I make a ranged attack against my unit, and then I heal 1 point for every hit that I score, right? And that makes sense. So it takes that really, really deep, rules-heavy kind of concept of magic and condenses it into a how can we make this still kind of function and feel like magic without all the extra steps. And again, I love the way they've handled magic in Old World. There's a few gripes I would have about it. Level 4 wizards are still just like an auto take. And I get it, but it's one of those where I'd like to see maybe magic get toned down just a little bit in Old World to where it's like you don't feel like you have to have a wizard in order to kind of play the game. But by and large, I love the way Old World handles magic. It does a good job of keeping the interactivity up by spreading the magic out, allowing different wizards to like dispel stuff like that. And where Kings of War maybe lacks interactivity, because there's no like dispels that I've seen, maybe there are, but I haven't seen any dispels. So where it maybe lacks that interactivity, it makes up for in the, okay, but we're just going to do our spell casting in this one phase, and it's going to be super quick and super easy, but it's still going to feel like you're casting a spell. And a great example of that is, I forget what the spell is called. I think it's Wind Blast. You roll 6 dice, and every hit literally pushes the target unit. It doesn't do damage. You push them 1 inch for every hit you get. So again, it still feels like I'm casting a spell. It doesn't feel like I'm just like, ranged attack. Well, here's my fireball. It's just generic dice. I might as well have a bow, right? It does a good job of saying, okay, look, we understand that this is kind of a simplified system, but we still want it to feel like magic. So that's kind of how they handle magic differently. And again, a little bit of a tangent, but that's important to understanding the turn structure, right? So once you get through all your phases, right, you've got your movement, which we talked about. You have your shooting phase. The main difference in shooting is going to be, just the complexity of the rules is going to be the main difference. Because your units have a facing, 99% of the time you can only shoot forward, right? With Old World, you're basically only going to get to shoot with the front rank unless you're on a hill. Then you get to shoot with the second rank, I believe. Don't quote me. I'm 99% sure that's the rule, though. And then if they have volley fire and you haven't moved, then you get to shoot with extra models as well. So again, we're already seeing how we have different rules to kind of trigger to allow you a higher volume of dice when you're shooting bows, for example. In Kings of War, it's a little bit different. And the reason is because in Kings of War, you're not going model to model, it's unit to unit. And that becomes important because of the way the rules are structured. With GW's Old World, it's model to model. So if this model can't see, this model can't shoot. With Kings of War, it's if the unit champion, the sergeant, whatever you want to call it, can't see, then the unit can't shoot. And again, it's one of those weird kind of interactions where if you're not used to that type of system, it's going to feel kind of gamey at first. But when you realize that everybody gets access to the same system, it kind of eliminates that gaminess feeling. And I did notice that when I first started playing Firefight, I was like, man, this is kind of weird. Like, this just seems like something that's really easy to game. But then the more I played it, I was like, oh, no, this is the intent. The intent is for you to play it this way. So, again, it's a little weird to wrap your head around because when you're shooting unit to unit, you just use the unit's attack value. So your units have attack values. And they're based off the unit size, which is really just how big their footprint is. So if you look at the one I just dragged around here, that's a regiment. And then you look at this one, this is a horde. So the regiment, and I'm just making numbers up. Actually, this should have their attacks. And they're not the same unit, but they're similar enough. So these have 15 attacks, and then the horde has 25 attacks. So again, your attacks value is just based off the unit. So when you go to shoot, you're going to roll 25 dice. You're going to have a target number equal to what their range characteristic is. So whereas Old World uses like the ballistic skill weird sliding scale, this just gives target numbers, very similar to like a firefight or a 40K. And you've got a height stat, so it's real easy to kind of determine what you can see over and what you can't. Whereas with Old World, it's not hard in Old World, because Old World's just got like a universal, you can't see over other units, period, end of discussion. Unless, right, like if it's a large target, you can see a large target even if there's intervening units. Whereas in Kings of War, it's like if you're height 3, you can see over height 2 units, right? So both do a good job of explaining how line of sight and things like that work and how intervening units work. And really, like I said, like that's the main difference is that we're going unit to unit instead of model to model. So, but both of them, you're going to roll your attack. So again, if we have a unit of archers and they may be 20 archers, and they have volley fire, and they're on a hill, you're going to get 5 shots for the front rank, 5 shots for the second rank because you're on a hill, and then half of each additional rank is going to get to shoot for volley fire. So it should give you 15 shots, right? Whereas in Kings of War, it's just if you can shoot, you just make all your attacks. So again, it's not that it's a hugely different system. It is, but it's just taking what Old World is doing and saying, okay, how can we do this, but make it a little faster? How can we cut out being on a hill? And not that hills don't do anything. I'm just speaking specifically to ranged attacks, right? Like, how can we cut out shooting in an extra rank? How can we cut out volley fire as, like, shooting with extra ranks? Well, we just give the unit an attack value, and then we do it that way. And again, it took me a little bit to be like, yeah, okay, this makes sense, But again, both do it well. One just does it with extra steps, takes a little longer. One does it a little faster. And when we get to the end of this video, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more because as I go along, I'm realizing it sounds like I'm just like, oh, Kings of War is just easier Old World, and it's not the case. It really isn't. It's how I felt about the game in first edition. It was just diet fantasy light, right? Like this weird kind of almost Warhammer fantasy. But having played Old World and Kings of War in the last month, I can tell you they feel like two different ways to do the same thing, right? And that's the best way for me to kind of explain it. So now you're probably thinking, well, like, yeah, that makes sense, but like, how do you resolve unit to unit shooting, right? Because in Old World, when a model dies, you pick the model up. So if you're doing model to model shooting or model to unit shooting, that makes sense, right? Like, oh, well, this model can see this unit, but this one can't, so I can only shoot this one, and then I can only kill one model. So the way Kings of War kind of works around that is you don't actually do model removal. So in Old World, when a model dies, you pick it up and you throw it in the trash, or you eat it, or do whatever the hell you want with it, right? In Kings of War, units just take damage. Think like Super Smash Brothers, right? You don't really have a life total. You just take damage. And then as you accumulate more damage, you are more and more likely to fail your leadership or your nerve checks. And this is where the games really start to set themselves apart, is in how damage works, nerve checks work, and things like that. So let's start with Old World. In Old World, if I shoot you and you lose, I think it's 25% of your models to shooting, you have to make a leadership check. It's called a panic test. You roll your leadership check. If you fail it, your model's literally like about face and run away. And it's a cool mechanic. I actually appreciate that type of mechanic. This KoW's War has a similar but different setup. Even Firefight, to some degree, has a similar setup, like if you lose a combat. Not from shooting, but specifically if you lose a combat. So, like, I like being able to use things like that to kind of manipulate movement and positioning. I think that's a good mechanic. If you lose a combat, that gets a little bit more in-depth. But really the main thing to know is if you lose a combat, you can also run away, or you can just die in Old World. Like, it's a tiered process. We don't need to break it down. I actually think I did a whole ass video on that. So I'm not going to break it down here. In Kings of War, at the end of any phase that you took damage, you make a nerve check. And then you add the damage to your nerve check. So if you roll 2 dice for a nerve check, and they're D6s, and then you add your damage, and then you'll have 2 different nerve values. So let me see. Let's see if we can pull up. I know I can. I guess we don't need to see. Kings of War list. Builder. Boop. And we're just going to hop in here so I can show you what something might look like. Okay. So if we bring this over, there we go. All right, so we can see that this infantry regiment, it's Sisterhood Infantry, this infantry regiment is 1416. So that means, and the reason I'm going over this and not necessarily Old World leadership is that I'm going to operate under the assumption that many of my viewers have played either Warhammer Fantasy or old 40K. And Old World is pretty much the same, right? We don't need to go over that. And even most historicals, pretty much the same. Make a leadership check, roll some dice, run away. In Kings of War, you have 2 values. You have your waver value and your route value. So you can see that these sisters are 14 for a waver, 16 for a route. That's a target number. So if you do 1 damage to me, and I roll 2d6, the most I can roll is 12, plus 1 is 13. So at 1 damage, I literally can't waver. Now, they have a special rule about rolling boxcars, but that doesn't matter for what we're talking about. And when you waver, wavering, the easiest way to just describe wavering is like you can't shoot and you can't, I think, charge. I could be wrong on that, but you definitely can't shoot. If you're wavered, you can't shoot. I don't think you can charge. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. Again, I'm still kind of getting these rules down. But they stay wavered until the end of their next turn. So if they waver on your turn, which they should because of how the game's structured, then on my turn, they are wavered, and then at the end of my turn, they unwaver. And I'll kind of circle back to that comment in a minute also. But if we hit 16, so like let's say they've taken 10 damage, and I've rolled a 3 and a 3 for my leadership, my nerve check, I now have a 16. They are routed. So now they're dead. That's it. You just pick them up. So you know that these sisters, once they hit 9 damage, right? 9 plus 7 is 16. At 9 damage, they have a roughly 50% pick them up or don't. So it's this kind of weird all or nothing interaction where it's like, all right, well, they don't really degrade. You just keep getting, like, they get 15 attacks. You just keep getting 15 attacks. But then once you fail that route check, they die. Now, there are things that you can do to keep them alive. Like if you have a command unit next to them, it'll help. If they're inspiring, I think is the word. It'll help them re-roll their checks, I believe. I've actually got it down here. So let's just make sure this is correct. Inspiring. If this unit or any friendly, blah, 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 the opponent must re-roll the nerve test. And I know it says the opponent. So let's go ahead and touch on this right now. I just kind of mentioned it. This is another one of those weird things that's different about the games, and I don't think it's better. I don't think it's worse. I just think it's different. In Old World, I roll my hit rolls, I roll my wound rolls, you roll your saves. If it has to do with my model, I roll dice. If it has to do with your model, you roll dice. Makes sense. What that does is it creates, whatever word you want to use, this system where it's like, I'm going to roll my causal dice, and then you're going to roll your reactionary dice. What Kings of War does is it says, if it's my turn, I'm the only person rolling dice. So if I'm shooting you, I get to shoot you, and then I roll your nerve check. And then if you have an inspiring unit, I must re-roll that nerve check if they're routed. So it's a little weird, and it can be a little off-putting. Because if it's my turn, there's literally nothing for you to do but just stand there and watch. Right? So like I'm moving, I'm rolling dice, and you're just thumbjacking your dirt box. That's all you're doing. So it's kind of weird. And honestly, like when I play with the kids, a lot of times I just have them roll the nerve checks. And a lot of that is because of my history with GW and 40K and Old World and Fantasy and all these other things. But it's important to note that, like, on my turn, I'm the only one rolling dice. So that's how nerve tests work. You know, like I said, it's this kind of weird thing where it's like, all right, you just accumulate damage. Once you take damage at the end of the phase, you roll your nerve test. If your nerve test passes, you're good. You move on with your life. If the nerve test fails, you check to see if they're wavered, or you check to see if they're routed. If they're routed, they just die. And that's how you do model removal in Kings of War. You know, so it's a weird system that's all or nothing. Whereas in like an Old World, you can reduce a unit's combat efficiency by dwindling their numbers slowly. You can play a bit more of an attrition game to some degree, and it's not that you can't in Kings of War. It's just done a lot differently. And I would say this is one area where Old World having more rules does make it a bit more effective for, especially for that type of play style, right? Because, again, if you've got an army that's designed to just like grind somebody down, and reduce their combat efficiency, you know, maybe I have fighting 2 ranks. But you've now knocked one of my ranks out. I'm now losing attacks. So now my swingbacks are going to be less effective. All that other stuff. So that's kind of where they're a little bit different. And again, I wouldn't say that Old World does it better because it's 2 completely different systems at this point. Where Old World shines is the ability to kind of manipulate those individual models, right? Like if you have a unit of zombies, you can bring extra zombies, right? If you started with 5, maybe you can go to 10. If you started with 10, maybe you can go to 15. Whereas with Kings of War, if you have a regiment, it's just a regiment that I've seen. There could be something else in there. Now, you can heal those regiments, like some of the undead units have what's called Life Leech, so every damage they do to a unit heals them, and then it's capped at whatever their Life Leech rating is. But what's cool about the way Kings of War does it is that you don't have to have models individually based. And you might be thinking, like, so what, man? Who cares? It's actually kind of a big deal. For a lot of reasons. One, if I want to, I can literally just like hypermagnetize everything to a movement tray, slap it on the table, and that's it. That unit just stays the way it is the whole game. So it eliminates like, pull these guys off, set them to the side, clean it up. Like, as dumb as it sounds, making cleanup faster is a benefit to me. As a person who can really struggle with more menial and mundane tasks, if you're telling me that cleanup is faster, like, I already appreciate it. And it creates some really cool hobby potential because you can do like a single base, right? So if we look back over here and we look at this horde, this whole thing is just one big base. And you could literally model different things on that base. You know, you could have maybe, because like in Old World, they started talking about unit fillers and stuff like that, but they still get picked up. Whereas in this, like, you could have like a little tent in the middle of your horde and like a little camp. Like, you could do more scenic things and stuff like that. So it does offer a bit more of a hobby-centric approach to unit construction, because you're really just trying to represent the unit as a whole rather than each model in the unit, if that makes sense. So it is pretty cool. I like it. But yeah, so that's the difference between how they would handle that. So now we've talked about how they handle movement. We've talked about how they handle shooting. We've talked about damage, nerve checks, magic, turn structure, combat. Combat, I think, to me, has been the biggest hang-up with Kings of War. There's some things about it that I still haven't figured out how to wrap my head around. And really, I just need to play a game with somebody who's more experienced than me so I can better understand what I'm reading. Because when I read some of this, I'm just like, this makes sense. Like, I understand what I'm reading, but I don't understand how this would be applicable or even beneficial. So, I'm not going to dig into some of that. Mostly because if I don't understand it, I don't want to try to explain it. But the main thing is that there's no reactionary attacks. Because if it's my turn, I'm the only one rolling dice. So if I charge you, I make attacks. Combat ends. And that takes a lot of, like, it makes my brain feel weird, like a certain kind of way. Because even Firefight has reactionary attacks. Dead Zone. I believe Dead Zone, you can make reactionary attacks. Old World, reactionary attacks. 40k, they're not necessarily reactionary attacks. Both units just fight, but same kind of thing. So it's just really weird for me to play a game where they're just like, no reactionary attacks. But why? Like... And maybe there are, and I'm just missing it. But the way I understand it is like, it's my turn. You don't attack. I attack. I do your nerve check. That's it. Done. And again, it's weird. I'm a little on the fence about it. It hasn't created any issues that I've seen. And again, the game's designed with this in mind. So obviously the design team's done a good job to make sure that it works within the confines of their system. It's just coming from literally every game I've ever played where everybody gets reactionary attacks. It's just super weird. And it's taken me more time to adjust to that than anything else. So that's the other thing. And then, like, there doesn't seem to be a lot of penalties for, like, falling back, charging, falling back, and shooting. Again, I've not gotten that deep into it yet, so if I'm wrong, please correct me. But, like, in Old World, there's no withdrawing. And that's another big difference between the two. Like, that's it. You get in combat, you're in combat until somebody's dead or somebody's routed. Like, there's a few other kind of exceptions to that, but that's generally the rule. Whereas with Kings of War, seems to be a bit more free with, like, I'm in combat, but I can just actually just charge another unit. Now, you still have to have line of sight to that unit, if I remember correctly. But generally speaking, it's just weird, you know. So overall, I think the goal behind Old World, right? I said we're going to talk about this. I think the goal behind Old World was to create a. If we leave the recreate fantasy goal aside, because clearly that was the goal, was to revive fantasy. If we leave that to the side, I think the intent or the goal behind the game is to have a hero hammer game where your heroes feel like these epic heroes. Not always, but you can very easily, right? With magic items and all these other things, like you can really soup them up to make them just like crazy good. So you almost have this role-playing game, combat game combination with armies. You know, you've got these heroes that you can slap all this different stuff on. You can kind of customize them, kit them out all these different ways. It's very rules heavy in terms of, you know, the movement, the shooting, all the modifiers, all the different special rules, all this stuff. You know, so it's a very rules-dense game to make a rank-and-file war game. I would consider Old World a war game. And I think it does that goal very well. You know, does it have its issues? Yes. It does have its issues, but every game does. But at the end of the day, its goal was to be very rules-dense and very customizable and filled with options, and to give you almost this like role-playing game narrative kind of feel. I think when I play Kings of War, what I see is a game whose goal is to almost bridge the gap between tabletop strategy and rank and file war game. Because there's a lot of room in between there, right? So, you know, we've got this war game that's very rules dense, and then we've got tabletop strategy where it's a lot of just like you can kind of do what you want to some degree. You know, again, if we look at 40K as a tabletop strategy, you know, there's not really much in the way of army structure. There's not really much in the way of restrictions on what you can and can't do. And it's more just like it's not a war game, right? And to me, Kings of War almost kind of bridges that gap. It takes both concepts and kind of puts them together. There is army structure, but it's not super restrictive. Like, it's predicated on taking certain units as a regiment. They're called unlocking units. Whereas in, like, Old World, it's based off of percentages. Like, if you're playing a 2,000 point game, 25%, I think it is, of your army has to have the core keyword. You know, so, like, you might take a few core units. And this is really, like, to me, this is something that probably needs adjusted in Old World. Because the way the game is played, and really the way fantasy has almost always been played, is you take the minimum amount of core units necessary so that you can just take, like, dragons and heroes and shit. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. There are restrictions. You have limits on what you can take in different units and stuff like that. And then, like I said, like with Kings of War, it's like, we're not quite as restrictive as Old World in terms of, like, a percentage of your points has to be this, and no more of them can be that. But there is at least enough structure that you understand you have to have some of this, before you can take some of that. And then if you also want some of this other thing over here, you still need a little bit more, right? So in terms of list building, it's not quite like free-for-all tabletop strategy, but it's not quite war game. And to me, that is the epitome of what Kings of War is. Like, we're not quite war game, using the definitions I did earlier, but we're not quite just like do what you want tabletop strategy. And it straddles that fence really well. For as well as Old World creates medieval fantasy battles, Kings of War does it in its own way just as well. So, what I guess really I want to say about both games is that, again, because this video was not intended to be a compare, contrast, as much as it was intended to be, hey, if you're looking at either of these things, this is what you're looking to get into. My final thoughts are going to be, if you want something that's very rules dense, and you want something that has gorgeous models, and you want something that's going to... It's going to take a while to play, right? If you've never played it, you're going to need to learn how to play. But if you want something that's probably also going to have a community around you because it is a GW game, Kings of War or Old World is great. Kings of War has been around for a while. I do know there are communities for it. Again, locally, I don't know, because locally, 40K has such a stranglehold on our region that it's really hard to get anything else going. From bolt action to Old World even, it doesn't matter. But if you want something that's going to give you that, it's going to scratch that rank and file itch, but instead of taking 3 to 4 hours for a game, it might take 2 to 3 for a big full-size game. And, then this is it, right? Like, it does a great job of fitting right inside its niche. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. It is very much we are going to take this simple game and we're going to make it as deep as possible, but make it very accessible. So, at the end of the day, I think they're both great games. I think that for me, like, there's room in my life for both. I don't need to say I only play Old World or I only play Kings of War. But I would understand if, like time is an issue and you just don't have time to learn 2 different systems. My recommendation to you would be, depending on what's more important to you, is volume of games more important? Because if volume of games is more important, then you just play whatever the community already supports really well, right? If complexity of rules is what you're looking for, you want something with a lot of depth and a lot of rules and just very dense material, Old World is what you're going to want. If you want something that offers a surprising amount of depth given its simplicity in design and takes a little bit less time to play, then I would say Kings of War is for you. It's one of those where it's hard for me to say that one is better than the other, because my misconception going into this was that Kings of War was just diet fantasy. But it is not. It is definitely its own game, and it definitely does a good job of being its own game. So, if you are, a newer player to either system, hopefully this helps you out a little bit. I am sorry if the structure of the video is a little goofy. Normally I outline them and then I go bullet point by bullet point. But like I said at the beginning of the video, I wanted to sit down and record this while it was in my head, because if I didn't, I wasn't going to record it and then it wouldn't have gotten made. So, as always, there's going to be some Amazon affiliate links in the bottom. If you want to support me, you can click them, make purchases. I appreciate it. And then Plague support video coming up soon.